Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. The first thing you noticed about the Central Telegraph office on Gordon Street was the sound. Not one sound, many sounds. The rapid percussive clatter of the instruments, each one translating intention into dots and dashes into copper and current, and the invisible movement of meaning across distance. The lower, more deliberate sound of the receiving instruments, printing their responses onto the paper tape. The voices of the operators calling acknowledgements across the long room, and underneath all of this, so constant that most people stopped hearing it within their first hour, the low, steady hum of the electrical current itself, moving through the wires, carrying what people needed to say to one another across distances that would otherwise take days. Harriet Vane had been hearing this sound for 19 years. She no longer heard it consciously. It was simply the quality of the air when she was at work, the way the room breathed. It was the autumn of 1883, Glasgow, and Harriet Vane, at 46 years of age, was at her desk by 7:30, as she always was, with the morning transmission log open before her and the watch pinned at her breast, marking the seconds with the same indifference it brought to everything. She was neither tall nor short, neither plain nor remarkable, but possessed that quality of absolute composure that caused everyone in the office, the operators and the messengers, and the occasional visiting official from the post office, to lower their voices slightly when she entered the room. Not from fear, from the instinctive recognition of someone who takes their work seriously and expects others to do the same. Her hair was the precise dark brown of the mahogany instrument cases that lined the operating room walls, going grey at the right temple only, which gave her face an asymmetry that people sometimes noticed without being able to account for. Her clothes were plain and well kept, always dark, always with a watch pinned at the breast, because in the telegraph office time was not background. It was the medium in which the work existed. She had come to telegraphy at 27, when the post office had begun taking on women operators, and she had presented herself at the examination with the quiet certainty of someone who has identified the right door and intends to walk through it. She had passed at the top of her cohort. Within 3 years she was training others. Within 10 she was supervisor of the Glasgow Central Office, the largest outside London, responsible for the accuracy and efficiency of everything that moved through 22 instruments during a 12-hour shift. She had come from a working family in Greenock. Her father had been a ship's carpenter. Her mother had kept a boarding house for sailors, with the practical competence of someone for whom competence was not a quality but a requirement. Harriet had inherited both the competence and the understanding that it was a requirement. She had also inherited something else, a belief, absorbed rather than decided, that what people said to one another mattered, that the attempt to communicate was not trivial. That word sent deserved to arrive. This belief had made her a good telegraphist. It had made her a better supervisor, and it had led her, in the 5th year of her supervisorship, to invent the Tuesday afternoon dead message review. This was not a task that appeared in any official description of her duties. It was something she had created herself. After a series of complaints from senders whose messages had failed to arrive and whose complaints had revealed a systematic problem with how undeliverable messages were being handled or not handled, filed and forgotten, a message became undeliverable for any number of reasons. The recipient had moved. The address was incomplete. The recipient had died. The recipient refused to accept the message. In all these cases, the message was supposed to be returned to the sender, with a note explaining why delivery had failed. In practice, this happened inconsistently. Messages accumulated. The file grew. Nobody looked at it. Harriet looked at it every Tuesday afternoon, between the end of the busy midday period and the beginning of the quieter late afternoon. She took the dead message file from the cabinet in her office and went through it. Every new entry since the previous Tuesday examined. Every reason for non-delivery checked and verified. Every message that could be returned to its sender returned. It was meticulous work and slow work. And it was work that the post office had not asked her to do and did not know she was doing. She did it because the alternative was messages disappearing entirely, becoming nothing. And Harriet Vane had always believed that a message sent deserved at minimum the attempt at delivery, that the effort to say something to someone was not nothing, that it deserved to be treated accordingly. On a Tuesday in October of that year, she found the old file. She had not found it before because she had not looked in the lower drawer of the archive cabinet, which was stiff from disuse and required a particular upward jerk to open, that she had not previously attempted. She attempted it now because she was looking for an old ledger and had exhausted the upper drawers. The lower drawer opened with the reluctant complaint of something that had been closed for a long time and had not expected to be opened again. The smell that came out was of old paper and dust and the particular staleness of a space that has been sealed from the air for some years. Behind a stack of old supply requisition forms were 3 cloth-bound files, thick, heavy, dated on their spines in faded ink, 1872 to 1874. Harriet had taken over the supervisorship in 1875. These files predated her. She lifted the first one out. Inside were undelivered messages, not the ordinary kind, not the ones with incorrect addresses or refused deliveries. These were different. Each message had a handwritten note attached, in a hand she did not recognize. Brief, administrative, and on each note the same word, withheld, not undelivered, not returned, not recipient, not found. Withheld. She sat down. The operating room noise continued beyond her office door, the clatter and hum and the voices calling acknowledgements. The clock on the wall marked the quarter hour. She opened the first message. It was addressed to a man in the East End of Glasgow, from a woman in Dundee. It said, "Father very ill. Please come at once. Do not delay." She read this 3 times. Then she turned to the note attached to it. Withheld on instruction of Sub-Supervisor Mackay, October 1872. No reason given. She put it down and opened the second message. A different sender, a different recipient, a different urgency. The same notation, withheld. She worked through the file for an hour. 47 messages in the first file, 53 in the second, 61 in the third, 161 messages sent between 1,872 and 1,874, withheld on the instruction of a sub-supervisor named Mackay, for no reason that any attached note recorded. 161 people who had tried to reach someone, 161 people on the other end who had expected a message that never arrived. She sat at her desk with the 3 files before her and felt something that she did not immediately have a word for. It was not quite anger, though there was anger in it. It was not quite grief, though there was grief in it. It was the feeling of someone who has spent 19 years in a particular work because they believe the work matters, and who has just found evidence that the work was, at some point, deliberately undone, that the thing she had always believed was worth doing had once been done in reverse, systematically, deliberately, by someone sitting in this building, at a desk like hers, making a decision she could not imagine making. She went back to the operating room. She managed the afternoon shift. She dealt with an equipment fault on instrument 14, a dispute between 2 operators about a transmission, a visit from a post office inspector who wanted the quarterly efficiency records. She did all of this with the same composure she always brought to the work. She did not mention the files. She carried them home in her bag. At her kitchen table in the October evening, with a lamp and a pot of tea, she read every message in all 3 files. 161 times someone had tried to reach someone else. 161 times the reaching had been stopped. She read them slowly, every word of every message, the formal and the informal, the businesslike and the desperate, the messages that said "come home" and the messages that said "I am sorry," and the messages that said simply "please write." She read them all because they deserved to be read, because someone had to, because a message sent is not nothing, even when the recipient never receives it. The wanting to say a thing is the beginning of the thing itself. By midnight, the lamp had burned low, and the tea was cold, and the 3 files were back in order on the kitchen table. She sat for a while in the dim room. Outside, Glasgow moved through its October night, the trams and the gas lamps, and the particular restless energy of a city that does not stop moving. In the morning, she would decide what to do. Tonight, she simply held them, all 161 of them, the way you hold something you have been trusted with and are not yet ready to put down, she thought, lying in the dark about what the work of a telegraph office was. Not mechanically, she knew that part well enough. She thought about what it was in the larger sense. It was a system built on a single premise, that the distance between people could be overcome, that someone in Dundee could reach someone in Glasgow in the time it took to tap out a message and wait for the response, that the wire running between cities was not just a physical cable, but a commitment, a public commitment, backed by the post office and the Crown, that if you handed a message to the counter and paid the fee and gave the correct address, the message would be delivered. That commitment had been broken 161 times between 1,872 and 1,874 in the Glasgow Central Office on Gordon Street. Someone had taken a message handed over in good faith and put it in a file and attached a note that said "Withheld," and the person who was supposed to receive it had waited and heard nothing. Some of those people were still alive. Some of them had spent 10 years believing. that the silence they had received was the answer, that no reply meant something about the person they had written to, that the distance had simply proven too great. Not knowing that the distance had been made artificially great, not knowing that a man at a desk had made the decision for them. She lay in the dark and felt the weight of this, not the weight of guilt she had done nothing wrong, the weight of responsibility. She was the supervisor of this office now. She had been, for 9 years, the person whose duty it was to ensure that the commitment was kept, that the messages moved, that they arrived, that when they could not arrive, the reason was known and the sender was told. And she had found, in the lower drawer of her own archive cabinet, evidence that this had not always been so, that before her time, under a different supervisor, the office had been something else, had been, for those 2 years, the instrument of exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to be. In the morning she would decide what to do. She had already, in some part of her mind, begun to decide, but she gave herself the night for it. Lay in the dark with the 161 messages and the weight of what they meant, and did not reach for the answer before it was ready. Outside, Glasgow breathed its October breath. The gas lamps burned on the street below her window. The trams had stopped running. The city was as quiet as it ever became, and in the copper wire beneath its streets, the current continued, faint and steady, carrying nothing at this hour but ready for morning, as it always was. She began with what she could verify. The personnel records for the Glasgow Central Office were kept in the same archive cabinet, upper drawers, in a set of bound ledgers going back to the office's opening in 1866. She found the entry for Sub-Supervisor Mackay on a Wednesday morning before the shift began, standing at the cabinet with the lamp she had brought from her desk. Robert Mackay, Sub-Supervisor, Glasgow Central, April 1870 to January 1875. Left service January 1875. Reason given? Resigned. No further notation. She copied the dates into her notebook. January 1875. 4 months before she took over the supervisorship. She had never known him, never heard his name, which was itself a kind of answer. A man who had left no particular impression on those who came after him. She returned to the files that evening. She sorted the messages into categories. Family emergencies, the largest group. Business matters. Personal messages that were neither emergency nor business, but simply someone trying to reach someone. And a fourth category that she identified slowly as she worked, reading more carefully. A subset of messages with something in common, not in their content, in their senders. 12 messages sent over the 3 years of the files, all originating from addresses in a particular district of the East End, all addressed to different recipients in different parts of the city, all withheld. 12 messages from the same small area. She did not know yet what this meant, but she wrote the addresses down because patterns were worth noting even when their significance was not yet clear. This was something 19 years of telegraphy had taught her. The value of the anomaly, the thing that does not fit the ordinary flow, is the thing most worth attending to. She was on the point of closing the last file when she found the note. It was tucked between two messages near the back of the third file, folded once, not addressed to anyone. In a hand she now recognized as Mackay's, the same hand as the withheld notations, slightly unsteady, suggesting someone writing quickly or under pressure. The note said, "These messages are held at the instruction of Mr. T, Cairns of Cairns and Sons, who has deposited the sum of £50 with this office for the purpose. I have recorded nothing officially as I was instructed not to. I write this for my own protection should the matter come to light. R.M. November 1873. Harriet sat very still. £50. In 1873, £50 was a sub-supervisor's salary for several months. Enough to make a man do something he knew was wrong, and write a note about it for his own protection, and then leave the note in the file for 10 years, presumably hoping no one would ever find it. Cairns and Sons. She knew the name. Glasgow was not so large a city that the major commercial names were unknown to its residents. A textile trading company, large, long established, the kind of firm whose name appeared in the business pages of the Herald with a regularity, suggesting steady success and the kind of connections that translated steady success into something more durable. At the city library on her dinner hour the next day, she asked for the newspaper archive from 1872. She found what she was looking for in the Herald from October of that year. A report of unrest at the Bridgeton Mill, meetings of workers, a counterstatement from the company. The dispute had begun in September 1872. The first withheld messages were dated October 1872. The same month, the same district. She sat in the library with the newspaper on the reading table and felt the connections settle into certainty. Not proof, exactly. Proof would require more, but certainty of her own, the kind that allows you to act without waiting for every question to be answered. The kind that says, I understand what happened here. Now I need to decide what to do with that understanding. The official answer was clear. Report it to the post office inspector. Submit the files as evidence. Allow the machinery of official investigation to proceed. She knew, from 19 years in a bureaucracy, what that machinery would do. It would turn, slowly, with the particular friction of a mechanism asked to address a problem involving people no longer employed, and events that had occurred a decade ago. It would produce, eventually, a report. The report would be filed. The senders of 161 messages would never know. The recipients would never know. And the company named in Mackay's note would receive, at most, a letter of inquiry from an official who was already thinking about something else. This was not enough. She knew that clearly. She did not know yet what enough would look like, but she knew it was not that. The young woman arrived on a Thursday morning. Harriet was reviewing the morning's transmission logs when one of the counter staff knocked and said there was a woman outside, asking to speak with the supervisor. She was not sending a message, he said with the expression of someone who does not know whether this is a reasonable request. She was asking about old messages, messages that had not been delivered. Send her in, Harriet said. The young woman was perhaps 28 or 30. She carried herself with the alert, slightly forward posture of someone who spends a great deal of time paying attention to things. Her coat was good, but worn at the cuffs. She had a notebook under her arm, and an expression that managed to be both polite and direct at the same time. The expression of someone who has come with a clear purpose and intends to pursue it, while remaining entirely civil about it. "My name is Clara Strang," she said. "I write for the Glasgow Courier. I am looking into allegations that messages sent through this office in the early 1870s were withheld without the knowledge of their senders or recipients. I wondered if you might be able to help me." Harriet looked at her. She looked at the notebook under her arm, and at the worn cuffs, and at the expression that was both polite and direct. She thought about the 3 files in her office drawer, and Mackay's note folded at the back of the 3rd file. She thought about 161 messages. "How long have you been looking into this?" Clara Strang's expression shifted very slightly. "About 6 months," she said. "I found a woman in the East End whose father died without ever receiving a message from her brother. The brother sent the message. She knows he sent it because he wrote and told her afterwards, but it never came. When I began asking, I found 3 other people with the same story, all from the same area, all around the same years, all of them workers at mills owned by Cairns and Sons." Harriet was quiet for a moment. The operating room hummed behind the closed door. The clock on the wall marked a half hour. "Sit down," Harriet said, "please, and close the door behind you." Clara Strang sat. She put her notebook on the desk and looked at Harriet with the attention of someone who understands that the next few minutes are going to matter. Harriet opened her desk drawer. She took out the 3 files. She set them on the desk between herself and Clara Strang. "I found these on Tuesday," she said. "I have been trying to decide what to do with them." She looked at the young woman across the desk. "I think you may be the answer to that question." 2 women sat across from each other in a post office supervisor's office on a Thursday morning in October 1883. One of them had spent 19 years learning how messages moved and what it cost when they didn't. The other had spent 6 months tracking the human cost of a particular failure. Between them, on the desk, were 3 cloth-bound files that connected those 2 kinds of knowledge into something neither could have reached alone. Clara Strang reached for the first file. Her hands were careful, the hands of someone who understood that what she was holding had weight. Not physical weight, the files were not heavy. The other kind, the kind that comes from being the record of a deliberate harm done to ordinary people by someone who had decided for £50 that their communications did not matter. Harriet watched her read. She watched her stop at the East End messages and open her notebook and begin writing with the focused speed of someone transferring information they have already been looking for. She is reading these for confirmation, Harriet thought. The files are filling in the gaps. The operating room continued its hum beyond the office door. The instruments sent their messages. The tape printed its long record of the morning's transmissions. And in the supervisor's office, 2 women began the particular slow work of understanding something together that neither of them would have been able to understand alone. "May I come back tomorrow?" Clara Strang asked, when the 2 hours had passed and the afternoon shift was starting. with more questions. "Come in the afternoon," Harriet said. "The shift is quieter then." Clara stood, put on her coat, tucked the notebook under her arm. At the door, she turned back. "Why did you keep them?" she asked. "The files. You could have reported it and handed them over. Why carry them home?" Harriet considered this. "Because I needed to read them," she said. "Every one." Before I decided anything, Clara Strang looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, as though this was exactly the right answer. Then she went. Harriet sat at her desk after the door closed. The office was quiet. Beyond the door, the operating room continued its work, the clatter and the hum and the tape printing its endless record. All the ordinary messages of a Thursday afternoon, crossing the city and beyond it, reaching the people they were meant to reach, arriving. This was what the work was for. This was what it had always been for. And now she had found someone who could help ensure that the particular failure she had uncovered did not simply return to the bottom drawer and wait for another decade. She put the files back in the drawer. She went back to the operating room. She managed the end of the afternoon shift. And in the evening, she walked home through the October streets of Glasgow with the particular feeling of something having been set in motion that will continue until it has reached its necessary end. She found herself, in the days that followed, thinking about what kind of person Robert Mackay had been. Not malicious, she thought, or not primarily malicious. The note he had written was not the note of a man who took pleasure in harm. It was the note of a man who was covering himself, who understood, at some level, that what he was doing was wrong, and wanted a record that the instruction had come from elsewhere. This was, in a way, more troubling than simple malice. A malicious man acts from conviction. A man who knows he is doing wrong and does it anyway, for money, and writes a note to protect himself. The man had made a calculation. He had weighed what he was being asked to do against what he was being offered for it, and decided the offer was sufficient. £50 for 161 messages, for 161 people who had tried to reach someone and been quietly, administratively prevented. She did not know what had happened to Mackay after he resigned, whether he had found other work, whether he had thought about what he had done, whether the note in the file was the last time he had thought about it at all. These were questions without answers. She set them aside. The dead could not be held accountable in the ways that mattered. What could be done was what remained to be done now. Clara Strang came back on Friday, and the Friday after that, and the pattern of their meetings established itself. Different kinds of work toward the same end. Harriet with the files and the official records. Clara with the sources and the narrative. Each checking what the other brought against what she already knew, finding the places where the two accounts confirmed each other, noting the places where they diverged, and working out why. Harriet had not expected to find this kind of collaboration satisfying. She was, by nature and by training, a person who preferred to work alone. The Telegraph office had trained her in a particular kind of careful independence, the ability to assess a situation quickly, make a decision, and act without requiring agreement from others. This was what supervisory work demanded. There was rarely time for consultation. But this work was different. This work was not fast. It was slow and incremental and required the contribution of both of them to become what it needed to become. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind the slowness, that the back and forth of it, the question and the answer and the new question, felt right for what they were doing. Some things needed to be arrived at together. This was one of them. Clara Strang came back on Friday, and the Friday after that, and on 2 Tuesdays in November. Each time she came in the afternoon, as Harriet had suggested. Each time she brought new questions, and sometimes new information of her own. Another source found, another connection traced. And each time Harriet answered what she could answer, and said clearly what she could not, and the conversation moved forward, in the way of work done properly, without shortcuts and without evasion. She found that she liked Clara Strang. This was not something she had expected. She had expected to find her useful, which was different. Useful was a category Harriet applied readily to people and situations. Liked was something she applied more slowly, more rarely, after more evidence. But Clara's way of working earned it. She did not embellish. She did not press for more than the evidence supported. When Harriet said, "I cannot confirm that," or "I do not know," or "that is outside what the files show," Clara wrote it down as such. She was building something intended to stand up, and she understood that what stands up is constructed from precisely what is true, and nothing beyond it. During their second meeting, Clara told her about Ellen Doherty. "The woman I found first," she said, 60 years old, still living in the East End. Her father died in November 1872. The message her brother sent from Dundee was asking him to come because their sister was very ill. He found out 6 weeks later that the message had been sent. He didn't know why it never arrived. He thought the Telegraph office had simply failed. He thought his father had chosen not to come. He and his father never reconciled before his father died in March 1873. Harriet looked at the files on the desk. She thought about the message she had read first. "Father, very ill. Please come at once. Do not delay." She thought about a man in the East End of Glasgow who never received those words, who never knew his child had tried, who died with the silence of that winter between himself and his son. And the brother, she thought, the brother who sent the message and heard nothing back and drew the only conclusion the silence offered him, that the father had chosen not to come, living with that, for years living with that. What was Cairns and Son's connection to the workers? Harriet asked. Clara opened her notebook to a page she had already filled. In 1872 there was a dispute at 2 of their mills. She said, workers were organizing, not yet a formal union. The law was ambiguous about that. But meetings, coordination across mills, the beginnings of collective negotiation. The company responded by, among other things, attempting to disrupt communication between workers and their families outside Glasgow. She looked up. If your family can't reach you easily, you're more dependent on the company. If messages don't arrive, you don't know what's happening at home. You can't make plans. You can't leave. It's a form of control, not a dramatic form, a very quiet one. Harriet thought about this, about the telegraph office as an instrument of control, The idea sat badly with her. The telegraph had always been, in her 19 years, the means by which ordinary people could reach one another across distances that had previously made reaching impossible. The democratization of communication. That was the phrase she had heard used at some official occasion early in her career, and she had believed it. She still believed it as a general principle. But general principles existed in specific conditions, and specific conditions could be manipulated by people with enough money and enough access. £50 and a cooperative sub-supervisor had been enough to turn the telegraph from a means of connection into a means of isolation. "How many sources do you have?" Harriet asked, with direct testimony. "4," Clara said, "but I believe there are more. The East End community is close. People remember. The difficulty has been getting them to talk to a journalist." She paused. "They were workers. They're accustomed to not being believed, or to being believed and nothing happening. The difference between those two things, from where they sit, is not always visible." Harriet understood this. She had come from a working family herself, though this was not something she mentioned in the telegraph office. She understood the economy of speaking, who you spoke to, what the cost of speaking might be, the rational calculation of people who had learned, through experience, when the cost of speaking exceeded the benefit. She thought about the files, about what they contained beyond the 12 East End messages, about the other 149. Some had also been targeted. Others may simply have been messages Mackay had withheld for his own reasons, under cover of the arrangement he had made with Cairns. Once a man had decided to do a wrong thing for payment, the calculation about other wrong things shifted. She looked at Clara Strang across the desk. She was perhaps half Harriet's age. She had been working on this for 6 months with 4 sources and no access to the files. She had come to the telegraph office on the possibility that the files existed and that someone might show them to her. "How did you know the files were here?" Clara looked at her with an expression that was almost a smile. "I didn't," she said, "but Mackay wouldn't have destroyed them. He wrote that note for protection. A man who writes a note for his own protection doesn't destroy the evidence it's connected to. He hides it and hopes." This was accurate. Harriet had thought the same thing herself, in different words. She felt, unexpectedly, the particular satisfaction of recognizing a mind working the same way as her own. Not identical, coming from a different place, but working the same way. "You need the files?" Harriet said, "for the story to have the evidence it needs." "Yes," Clara said. "And I need the story," Harriet said, "because the post office inspector will file a report and it will disappear. And these people deserve better than a report that disappears." Clara looked at her carefully. "That is not the answer I expected," she said. "From a post office supervisor." "I have been a post office supervisor for 9 years," Harriet said. "Before that I was an operator for 10. Before that I was a woman who understood that institutions can be both good and capable of being used for the opposite of their purpose." She looked at the files on the desk. These people sent messages because they believed the telegraph office existed to carry them. They were right to believe that, and they were failed. The least I can do is ensure that what failed them does not simply remain in a bottom drawer. They worked together for 4 weeks. Not every day. Clara had other work, and Harriet had a telegraph office to run. But regularly, systematically, each contributing what she knew to the growing shape of the story. By the end of November, Clara had 8 sources. The files were documented. Mackay's note was photographed. The connection to Cairns and Sons established, with enough precision that Clara's editor had agreed to run it. Harriet prepared her official report. 5 pages, typed, setting out the discovery, the contents of the files, the note, the connection to Mackay's personnel record, and her recommendation for a formal inquiry. She dated it the morning the paper was due to publish, not a day earlier, not a day later. She had thought carefully about this sequence, the simultaneous submission and publication. The inspector would not be pleased. She had prepared her answer for that. The evening before the paper published, she sat at her kitchen table and read the last few messages in the 3rd file once more. Not all of them, just a few, the ones that had stayed with her. Father very ill. Please come at once. Do not delay. I am sorry. I should have written sooner. Please write back. Come home. We need you here. She read them slowly. Then she closed the file. Then she went to bed. Outside, Glasgow moved through its November night, and in the copper wire beneath its streets, the current continued to flow, carrying the day's messages to their destinations, arriving where they were supposed to arrive, doing what the work was supposed to do. In the morning, she would submit the report. In the morning, the paper would publish. And what happened after that was beyond her to determine. She had made her peace with this, in the same way she made peace with all things outside her control, by being clear about what was inside it. She had opened the drawer. She had read the files. She had found someone who could use them. She had written the report. This was what she could do. This was what she had done. It was enough. During their 3rd meeting, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the rain was coming in off the Clyde and the operating room windows were streaming, Clara asked Harriet about the work itself. Not the current situation, the ordinary work, what it was to spend 19 years managing messages. Harriet considered this. She was not accustomed to being asked about herself. The post office did not encourage supervisors to reflect on the personal dimensions of their work. But Clara asked with the same attention she brought to everything, not casually, not as an introduction to something else, but as a genuine question that she wanted a genuine answer to. The work teaches you things, Harriet said eventually, about what people need to say, about the urgency of certain kinds of communication. She paused. Most of the messages that come through here are ordinary. Business transactions, logistics, the usual traffic of a commercial city. But the ones that aren't ordinary, the ones that say come home, or I am ill, or please write, those are reminders of what the system is actually for, what it was built for, not commerce, connection. Clara wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. Is that why you invented the dead message review? Harriet nodded. When a message doesn't arrive, the person who sent it doesn't know. They assume it arrived. And when there's no reply, they wonder, She looked at the window, at the rain. The wondering is what I can't accept. The not knowing, even when a message genuinely cannot be delivered. Wrong address, recipient moved, recipient died. At least the sender can be told. At least the wondering stops. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The people in the files have been wondering for 10 years. Yes, Harriet said, that is exactly it. The story they were building together would not give all of them answers. It could not. The files contained what they contained, and many of the senders and recipients would never know whether their particular message was among the withheld ones. But the story would do something. It would make the wondering smaller. It would offer the possibility, at least, that the silence had not been what it seemed, that the absence of a reply did not mean the absence of care. Harriet had thought about this carefully. She was not by nature a sentimental person, and she was wary of overstating what any action could achieve. Newspapers published, stories were read and discussed, inquiries were held, and then time passed and things moved on, and the world was more or less as it had been. But some things changed. Not the large things, usually, not the structures, the small things, the individual understanding, the particular woman who had carried for years the weight of wondering whether her message had been received, and who would now, at least, know that the wondering was not unreasonable, that the silence had had a reason, that the trying had been real. These were not small things, Harriet thought. They were not large things either. They were the particular, exact-sized things that the work she did was capable of achieving. And she had, over 19 years, learned to value the particular and exact-sized more than she had when she was young, and believed the only worthwhile achievements were large ones. She managed the November shifts. She met with Clara. She wrote her report. She did the Tuesday dead message reviews. She tended the instruments and checked the operators and kept the current flowing through the copper wire and the messages moving to where they were supposed to go. The ordinary work, which was not ordinary at all, which was, she had come to understand, exactly enough. The story appeared in the Glasgow Courier in the last week of November. Harriet read it at her kitchen table on the morning it was published, before going to work. A pot of tea, the lamp lit against the early dark, the newspaper folded to the page. She read it the way she had read the messages, slowly, every word, attending to both what was there and how it was arranged. Clara had written it well. The story was clear and the evidence set out in order, and the people who had been affected were named and their experiences described with the precision and respect of someone who understood that naming a person in print is not a small thing. Ellen Doherty was there, 3 others. Their names, their stories, the specific messages that had been withheld, the specific consequences. Harriet was named in the story as the supervisor who discovered the files. She had expected this and had accepted it when Clara asked whether she was willing. She had thought carefully before agreeing. 19 years in the post office. The question of what this would cost, and then the question of what not doing it would cost, in a different currency, the kind that couldn't be counted in professional consequences. She had agreed. The post office inspector called her in that same afternoon. She had expected this too. she had prepared carefully. She brought the files and her own documentation of what she had found and when, and she presented the sequence of events in the same clear, ordered way she would have presented any operational problem. The inspector was a man of 50, experienced, not unkind, and visibly uncertain whether to be more troubled by what the files contained or by the fact that a supervisor had given them to a journalist before reporting them through official channels. Harriet had anticipated this uncertainty. "I reported it through official channels this morning," she said, placing on his desk the formal report she had written at 5 in the morning. The publication of Miss Strang's story was simultaneous, not subsequent. The inspector looked at the report. He looked at the files. He looked at Harriet. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "This is going to cause some difficulty." "I believe it should," Harriet said, quietly and without aggression, simply as a statement of what she believed. There was a formal inquiry. It took 3 months. Harriet gave her evidence and returned to her work, and managed the office as she had always managed it, with the same composure and the same attention to what the work required. The inquiry found what the files contained, which was already in the newspaper, and issued recommendations, which were largely procedural, and declined to pursue the company named in Mackay's note, on the grounds that the events were more than 10 years past. Harriet had expected this. It did not surprise her. She had not expected the inquiry to reach further than it reached. She had expected the newspaper story to reach further than the inquiry. She had been right about this. People talked about it for weeks. Letters were written to the paper, some from workers who had received no messages and now suspected why. Some from people who asked whether the same had happened in other cities. Some from people who simply wanted to say they had sent a message once, years ago, that had never been replied to and had always wondered. Clara brought Harriet a copy of the letters, not to publish, just to read. They sat in Harriet's office one afternoon in December, the heating having finally decided to work, the operating room humming beyond the door. Clara had a cup of tea, and Harriet had a cup of tea, and between them were the letters, which Harriet read as carefully as she had read everything else. "Most of them cannot be answered," Harriet said eventually. "We don't know which messages were deliberately withheld and which were simply lost by ordinary failure. There's no way to tell these people with certainty." Clara nodded. "I know," she said, "but some of them aren't asking for that." She picked up one of the letters. "Some of them are just glad someone looked at the files, glad someone found out that it happened. Even if their particular message wasn't in the files, even if they can't know for certain. It matters to them that it was known, that it was public, that it happened and someone said so." Harriet looked at the letter in Clara's hand. A short letter, just a few lines, from a woman in the East End who signed herself only with her initials. "I sent a message in October 1873 that was never answered. I always thought he had not wanted to reply. I am glad to know it may not have been so. Thank you for looking." Harriet read it twice. "Thank you for looking." This, she thought, was the whole of it. Not the inquiry, not the official recommendations, not even the company being named in print. This, the fact of looking, the fact of the bottom drawer being opened and the files being taken out. and someone reading every message slowly because the messages deserved to be read. She thought about Tuesday evenings with the dead message file. 19 years of them. The messages that could be returned, returned. The messages that could not, logged and archived. The ordinary, unremarkable work of ensuring that what people sent was treated as though it mattered. Because it did. It always had. It always would. Clara left at 4. The afternoon shift continued its measured progress. The instruments clattered and the tape printed, and the voices called their acknowledgements across the operating room. Harriet sat at her desk for a while after the door closed. She thought about Ellen Doherty, 60 years old, who had held for years the knowledge that a message was sent, and the uncertainty about what had happened to it, and who now knew, at least, that it had been stopped deliberately, who now knew that the silence had not been indifference. This was not everything. Harriet was not inclined to overstate what had been achieved. The father had still died without receiving the message. The brother had still lived for years believing his father had not come. These facts did not change. But Ellen Doherty knew now that her brother had tried. She knew the trying had been real. She knew it had been stopped by someone else's decision, and not by any failure of love. This was not everything, but it was something, and something Harriet had learned across 19 years of this work was what you did with what you had. You found what was in the bottom drawer. You read what was there. You decided what it required. You did it. She put on her coat. She gathered her bag. She made her final check of the operating room. The instruments all running. The operators steady at their keys. The tape printing its long record of the day's messages. Everything that needed to be sent was being sent. Everything that needed to arrive was arriving. The current moved through the copper wire, with its low, steady hum, so constant she no longer heard it consciously, but knew it only by the quality of the silence when it stopped. She walked home through the December evening, the city lit and busy around her, the shops and the trams and the smell of coal smoke and cold air. She walked at her usual pace, unhurried, steady, the pace of someone who knows where she is going and has no need to rush. She arrived home. She made her supper. She sat at her kitchen table for a while, with a cup of tea, and the small domestic quiet of an evening that belonged entirely to her. Tomorrow she would go back to the office. Tomorrow the instruments would clatter, and the tape would print, and the messages would move through the copper wire, and she would be there as she had always been, tending the instruments, checking the operators, examining the dead message file on Tuesday afternoons, doing what the work required. Nothing more and nothing less, except when more was required, and then that too. And now, dear listener, it is time for you to rest. You have sat with Harriet in the Telegraph office on Gordon Street, where the instruments clatter and the current hums in the copper wire, and the messages of the city move through the air like something alive. You have been in the room when a bottom drawer was opened, and something that had been waiting for 10 years was finally found. You have watched two women, 19 years apart in age, do what they could with what was there. Let your breathing slow now. Let the hum of the Telegraph office become the hum of the evening around you. Let the day's urgencies move through their wire and out into the distance and grow quiet. You do not need to carry everything tonight. Some things can wait until morning. Some things are already in motion and do not require your attention to continue. The current moves through the copper whether you watch it or not. Close your eyes. The instruments are still. The office is dark. The city outside is settling into its night. Somewhere a message is arriving that someone has been waiting for. Somewhere a bottom drawer is being opened and something is being found. Somewhere someone is reading carefully because what is in front of them deserves to be read carefully. This is enough. This has always been enough. Sleep now. The messages will continue to move through the wire. The morning will come, and you will be there to receive whatever it brings. Good night, she thought, walking home, about the nature of the work she had been doing for 19 years. Not the mechanics of it. She knew those well enough. The meaning of it. She had always known, at some level, that the work mattered. This was not a realization. It was the thing that had sustained her through the difficult years and the difficult supervisors and the difficult decisions and the Tuesday afternoons with the dead message file, when every entry was a small defeat and the best she could do was make the defeat as small as possible. What had shifted in the weeks since she had opened that lower drawer was her understanding of why it mattered. Or not a new understanding exactly, a more complete one. The files had shown her what happened when the work was inverted, when the system built for connection was turned toward disconnection, when the instrument designed to carry words was used to hold them back. And in seeing what it looked like when the work was wrong, she had seen more clearly what it looked like when the work was right. The current moving, the messages arriving, the person at the other end of the wire receiving what had been sent to them, understanding, at last, that someone had tried. This was what she had been doing for 19 years. This was what she would keep doing. Every morning, the shift would begin. Every Tuesday afternoon, the dead message file. Every instrument checked. Every operator trained. Every anomaly investigated. And occasionally, in a lower drawer, something that required more than the ordinary work. Something that asked her to decide, to act, to be, for a while, something more than the keeper of the instruments. She had done that. She did not regret it. She would not, she thought, need to do it again soon. These things did not come often. Most of her working life was the ordinary work, the maintenance and the management, the Tuesday afternoons and the quarterly reports and the equipment faults on instrument 14. But she was glad she had been there when this one came. Glad she had opened the drawer. Glad she had read the files. Glad she had known what to do with them. Her street was quiet. The gas lamps made their circles of yellow light on the pavement. The December air was cold and clean. She let herself in, hung up her coat, put the kettle on, stood in her kitchen in the lamplight, and listened to the kettle begin its slow building toward the boil. Tomorrow the work would continue, as it always did, as it should, and she would be there for it, as she had always been, with her watch and her composure and her unshakable belief that what people sent to one another deserved to arrive.